Hello, dear students. Today we are discussing the second part of lecture number 6 of your Cultural Studies course. The lecture is entitled Franz, Fanon and National Culture. As you remember, in the last lecture we talked about Fanon as an intellectual, a psychiatrist, and a freedom fighter. And we talked about his being one of the founders of what later came to be known as post-colonial theory. We also mentioned his participation in wars of liberation, especially the Algerian War of Liberation, and the strict stance he took in relation to the French colonizers. Today we will continue the thoughts of Franz Fanon. We will talk about culture and the role of the intellectual in liberation struggles. And this point was discussed in details in Fanon's book entitled The Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961. When we talk about liberation struggle, we visualize an oppressed nation, a colonized people, and a Western colonizer, the French colonizer in the case of Algeria. We can imagine that the French authorities are ruling the Algerian people and oppressing them, exploiting the natural resources of their country, imposing the French culture on the native culture, and so on. Fanon realized quite well that the wretched of the earth, the title of his book, refers to the colonized people, whether in Algeria or in other colonies all over the world. And he also realized that these wretched people are always ready and committed to resistance against the oppressor, and they are ready to undergo sacrifices in order to liberate their country and to gain the right of self-determination, provided that they have the appropriate type of leadership. According to Franz Fanon, this leadership is embodied in the native intellectuals. When we talk about the native intellectual, the concept explained by Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, the native intellectual is one of the colonized people, and usually he has had the advantages of an education. Usually this education was in the schools of the colonizer. He was brought up within the educational system authorized by France, this intellectual, whoever he is. Of course, we are not talking about just one person. We are talking about a group of people, a group of natives, whether the natives of the Martinique or the natives of Algeria or any colonized country. Some of them have had the advantage or the privilege of getting an education. These people, the intellectuals, they have an important role to play in the liberation struggle of their country. They need to lead their people, because without the suitable leadership, the masses cannot achieve anything. People always need to be led and guided under responsible leadership in order to be able to attain their righteous goals of independence. Franz Fanon himself, by the way, can be considered one of these native intellectuals if you are talking about his country, the Martinique. He was a native of the Martinique and he got the French education, which gave him the advantage to be able to fight for the freedom not just of his people but of all the oppressed people. So when he speaks about the native intellectual and his role in liberation movements, he is doing this from a position of first-hand experience. Some native intellectuals think that if they write the words of a song or if they play the music accompanying the words, if they sing a song about patriotism and about the fatherland and about their country and their love for the country and so on, if they do such a thing, they think that we are doing our role. Our role is to sing patriotic songs or to write enthusiastic articles in the newspapers in order to raise the consciousness of our people. Or maybe we can write a novel or a play, or we can draw a painting, or any of these works, cultural artifacts, if you like, that are related to our people. Now, Franz Fanon agrees that maybe a patriotic song or a consciousness-raising novel or play or poem or an expressive painting, maybe any of these works of art can help the people to understand their struggle and their position and can encourage them and give them a booster dose of self-confidence to enable them to stand up to the oppressor. But in the chapter entitled on national culture, which is one of the chapters of the book The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon underlines the fact that this is not enough. It's not enough to have revolutionary songs or to have provocative and propagandist works of literature or art. It's not enough to do this if you are a responsible intellectual and you want to perform your role. You need to do much more than this. You need to try to search for your cultural roots, the past tradition of the ancestors. You need to help to discover these cultural roots because the colonizer, especially the French colonizer, has tried to erase these cultural roots in an effort to delete the identity of the people. So if you are willing to perform your role as a native intellectual, this role would involve searching for the cultural roots of your people, trying to awaken the traditions, the lost traditions, beliefs, value systems that you used to have in the times before colonialism. And in other words, you need to be part of a movement of cultural revival. Fanon was one of the first intellectuals to describe how cultural revival is always a necessary first step or a prerequisite or a preliminary stage before any successful liberation struggle. You cannot gather the people and try to militarize them and try to help them with the strategies of guerrilla warfare or so on if these people feel self-defeated, if these people do not have self-confidence, if they have lost their pride and dignity because of all the repeated attacks across the years from the colonizer. The colonizer is always trying to tell the people, you are inferior, you are savage, you want to become civilized, then you have to be part of the French civilization. And step by step, the people are going to believe these claims by the colonizer. Some of them will even try to be totally assimilated with the colonizer, losing their identity and losing their self-respect and dignity. And a defeated people without self-respect or dignity can never be led in a successful, conquerous liberation struggle. So, Fanon says that the intellectual needs to be part of a movement of cultural revival in order to counteract the false claims of the colonizer about the barbarian state of the colonized. Thus, the native intellectual will help to boost the confidence of his people and will help to reconstruct their wounded identity, the identity that has been damaged by the successive misrepresentations and stereotyping practiced by colonial regimes. As we said, this cultural revival is an essential preliminary stage for the rise of liberation struggles and for their successful outcome in order to achieve independence, liberation, and self-determinism. Of course, Fanon's work was not only influential in the context of the Algerian liberation struggle. As we mentioned before, the man and the thoughts of Fanon transcended the boundaries between the various colonized people, between the oppressed, wherever they are. His words reached people in places as far away as the USA and as many African countries, as the West Indies, as countries in Southeast Asia, and so on. He also highlights in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, that there are risks that beset the role of the intellectual, the native intellectual, and these risks must be taken into consideration. The native intellectual must understand very well that his task is not an easy task. First of all, most probably because this native intellectual has been brought up within the educational system of the colonizer, then there is a sort of internalizing of the negative stereotype. He was brought up to believe that because he went to French schools, because he can speak the French language fluently, because he has a university degree or whatever, then he is better than his people. These people are without any civilization and they are inferior and they have to be led as children are led by their parents. He has been taught, this intellectual most probably has read the works of literature of the French authors and has come to see France as a mother country, and therefore he requires an eye-opener such as the traumatic experience that we mentioned and which happened to Fanon when he first went to live in France in order to get a university degree. In addition to acknowledging the risk of internalizing the negative stereotypes propagated by the colonizer, the intellectual must understand that he has a legitimate inner conflict. It is the conflict between the Western education he has received and the traditional roots of the national culture of which he is a part due to his ancestry or genealogy or whatever. Thus, Fanon's native intellectual can be seen as a type of the organic intellectual described by Gramsci, keeping in mind that the native intellectual, in the case of a colonial situation, has to fight a fiercer battle than that has to be fought by the organic one. Fanon theorized the stages of the work of the organic intellectual. The first stage would be an imitation of the Western models. By this he means that since this intellectual has the advantage of a Western education, then he can benefit from this education by reading the works of the political philosophers, Western political philosophers, and what they mentioned about the political rights of the citizens, about the types of government, and about the social contract between the rulers and the ruled, and maybe can benefit also from past experiences of other nations. So this is the first step in the work of the intellectual. It would be imitation of Western models. The second step is the search for cultural roots that we have mentioned before. Cultural revival, as we said, is a necessity before engaging in any successful liberation struggle. And this is what we call the third step. So we have an intellectual imitating the Western models. This is number one, or the first stage. And then number two, searching for the ancestral cultural roots. And number three, achieving cultural revival. Only then, after the achievement of the cultural revival, can the intellectual successfully lead his people in their struggle for independence. Fanon was a cosmopolitan. He considered that liberation struggles all over the world have to share their experience and offer mutual support to each other, always keeping in mind that they do have common ground, the common grounds of being oppressed, the common grounds of needing to gain their independence, but simultaneously knowing that no two cultures are exactly identical. Each national culture has its own specificity that needs to be respected. In other words, maybe a certain liberatory experience that happens in a certain place can help give us some broad lines about how to conduct our own experience or struggle of liberation, but we cannot take a 100% photocopy of this struggle and apply it in a different situation, because cultures have similarities as well as differences. So each culture should adapt the method of its liberation struggle according to its cultural specificity. Now, if we read the second point on this slide, we will find that one further issue discussed by Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth refers to the weak points of liberation movements and their impact on recently independent countries. Again, let me remind you, some intellectuals, philosophers, writers, they have this high level of consciousness that makes them prescient. They can see things in advance. Franz Fanon was one of those. He was living during the middle decades of the 20th century, the decades immediately following the Second World War, the 1950s and the 1960s. He died in 1961. And these decades are always known for their revolutionary purity and almost a romantic view of liberation struggles. People thought of all freedom fighters as heroes that can do no wrong, and they had these rosy dreams about the future of their countries once they gain independence from the colonial regimes, whether the French ones or the British ones or the Italian ones, and sometimes Germany even. But Fanon was not deceived by this aura of optimism. He was optimistic and he had confidence that the people are going to win the struggle in the end. Yet at the same time, he was very well aware that there are certain weak points in liberation movements, and these weak points need to be treated so that they do not have a devastating impact on the countries that have become recently independent. These weak points mainly refer to the corruption, the self-interest, the nepotism, the lack of sincerity or lack of loyalty to the motherland, hypocrisy. Some of the so-called leaders of the people, after the countries get their independence, they turn into tyrants and oppressors, and they reveal their real self-serving nature. They become like the new colonizer, only this time it's a colonizer who belongs to the same race and has the same skin color as the natives of the country. Fanon was well aware of that and tried to ring the bell. He tried to tell us to beware that newly liberated states, once they get their independence, must try to go back to their authenticity, the authentic traditional value systems that have been prevalent in these countries before the arrival of the colonizer. These value systems have become disrupted by the sudden arrival of this colonizer, or what we call the colonial encounter or the colonial trauma. It caused disruption to these belief systems that have been for sometimes thousands of years, millennia, prevalent in certain societies in Africa or elsewhere. So, according to Fanon, the only guarantee that would provide immunity to the newly liberated countries is to try and curb down corruption, nepotism, self-interest, hypocrisy. How to do this? By trying to restore the traditional values and the authenticity, while at the same time benefiting, of course, from the technological progress and the modern inventions and systems and institutions that have been gained by the colonial encounter. A case in point here can be the famous award-winning novel Things Fall Apart. It's a novel that was written in the 1950s by the Nigerian author Chinua Achebe. He wrote it in perfect English language, which was the language of the colonizer in Nigeria, because it was a British colony for a long time. And in the novel, Chinua Achebe describes how his people had their own system of governance. They had the elders of each tribe. They had their economic and social rules and regulations and organization. They had their own tribal institutions that are embedded in their social reality. And things have been going smoothly with the people, the many tribes of Nigeria, for centuries and millennia, until the sudden onset of colonialism disrupted the whole structure. Achebe was referring to the need to recapture this lost culture, this lost identity, this lost authenticity, to try to go back to the values that have been upheld by the tribal elders and respected by everyone in the community before the arrival of the British. At the same time, not neglecting that the newly liberated nations need to benefit from the Western educational systems, industrial revolution, medical progress, scientific technology, and so on. So this point about the weaknesses that can happen when one white colonizer is replaced by another black colonizer was referred to in Fanon's work and was like a warning about how to deal with such a risk. One of Fanon's famous books that we referred to in an earlier slide is the book entitled, in its translation, A Dying Colonialism, and the original French title was about the 5th year of the Algerian Revolution. In this book, Fanon refers to the cultural and political changes that emerge due to the rejection of French colonial oppression by the Algerians. He discusses issues such as the role of women in the liberation struggle, the changes that happened in family life, and even, interestingly and significantly, the role of the media, especially the radio at that time, during the 50s and 60s, the role of the radio and of medicine, which can be both tools of oppression and complicity on the one hand, and tools of freedom and liberation on the other hand. He also discussed in this book, A Dying Colonialism, he discussed the status of Algeria's European minority and their role as potential allies in the conflict. So now we have a book that discusses issues way in advance of its time. And there is this interesting point about how a single discipline or system, such as medicine or the media, they can be used as tools of oppression, and they can be complicit and cooperative with the colonial authority oppressing the people. If you use, for example, obligatory sterilization or family planning in order to decrease the number of the population of the colonized people by forcefully sterilizing them to prevent them from getting children, this would be an oppressive use of medicine. On the other hand, if you have this real medical progress which raises the health standards of the people and applies healthcare system, universal healthcare system to everyone in the population, including preventive healthcare and public health strategies and so on, in this case, medicine is used as a tool of freedom and liberation. And of course, the same applies to the media. We cannot always say that the media, in this case the radio, it was the type of media that Franz Fanon had in mind. We cannot say that the radio is on the side of the colonizer all the time, or the radio is on the side of the colonized, because it depends on how you use it. And one final point with which to end this long lecture refers to the interaction with the radio broadcasts during the Algerian Revolution. But before we go to this point, first we need to refer to the Algerian European minority. You have to remember that when France colonized Algeria, some French people went and settled in Algeria. And for generations, they became almost like French Algerians, if you like. And some other Europeans from Italy or Greece, they also went there and they settled there one generation after another. Of course, these European settlers remained a minority, a numerical minority. If we compare them with the original population, they are a numerical minority. But Franz Fanon was preaching that this minority, they are affiliated to a certain degree with the native population, and that maybe if the organic or native intellectuals and the leaders of the liberation movements try to take this minority to their sides, try to convince them of the legitimacy of their case, then this European minority can be of great help by propagating the just case of the oppressed people. Now, we just have one final anecdote about the radio broadcasts during the Algerian Revolution. It is the final point in our lecture, and it was mentioned and discussed in the same book entitled Dying Colonialism. Fanon mentions that the Algerian people had a problematic relation with the radio, and that this relation changes. Before the War of Liberation, they did not at all care to buy a radio set or to listen to the channel of Algeria, even if they could afford the price of the radio set. They were totally indifferent to the radio. So their attitude towards the radio was an attitude of indifference before and I put like 10 lines under the word before the liberation struggle, before the beginning of the liberation struggle. The reason for this indifference is that most Algerians considered the radio broadcasts to be the official voice of the colonizer, the official voice of the French authorities. And they used to say, why should we care about French people talking to other French people? They have nothing to do with us. But Fanon tells us that this relationship between the Algerian population and the radio broadcast had a 180-degree reversal after the launching of the revolutionary Algerian War. The radio became the only means of getting news of the war and of getting to know about the defeats and the victories, and enabling the Algerian population to follow up their liberation struggle. The change that happened in the relation between the people and the radio was a gradual change, bit by bit. It changed from a negative relation to a positive relation gradually until the end of 1956. An important event related to the liberation struggle happened during this year. It was the launching of a new revolutionary channel that never existed before. The channel was called The Voice of Free Algeria, or Free Algeria Voice, and there were certain secret manuscripts distributed among the population announcing the schedule of the broadcasts of this channel. These manuscripts were exchanged clandestinely by the people, and Fanon tells us that in less than 20 days, all the market supply of radio sets were sold out, especially the transistors that needed batteries to work, because the people, the Algerians who lived in remote areas, in the deserts, for example, or remote cities, they had no electricity, and the transistor, the battery-operated transistor, was the only means that could connect them to the news of their war of liberation. Of course, the French authorities realized what was happening, and it enforced a jamming of the radio broadcasts so that the people couldn't listen carefully to what was being broadcast. But the French authorities felt this was not sufficient, so they enforced a ban on the sale or even the acquisition of radio sets unless one had a military security clearance that was issued to him. Thus, the identity of the radio set was reversed from a hostile object used for cultural oppression of the people to a liberating tool helping to establish and maintain lost identity. This is the end of our lecture on Franz Fanon and his revolutionary intellectual work. And as we said, whenever we study post-colonial literary theory, we need to keep in mind the name of one of the pioneers of this theory. Thank you. Good luck.